lesson number 13 in our study course on the miracle of America, the great story of the American heritage. And we're right in the midst of the famous amendments to the Constitution, and our lesson 13 begins at that point. You know, after the Founding Fathers got their Bill of Rights, everyone assumed that that was enough. The first 10 amendments would be all that was necessary. But within a very short period of time, they needed 2 more amendments, and that's where we begin with right off the bat. All right, the 11th Amendment, Roman numeral 1. It provided that a state cannot be sued by the citizen of another state. Well, now they had already said in the Constitution that that was possible in Article 3, you see, but they had discovered that that wasn't good to have a state hauled in before the federal court at the instance of just an individual citizen and sue that state without its consent. It violated what was called state sovereignty. So it was taken care of as a result of a Mr. Chisholm of North Carolina suing Georgia and the federal court ordering Georgia to come in and respond. And was Georgia surprised? So they said there's a weakness there, we've got to correct it. So capital A, your blank, is ordered. Ordered. Now capital B, the states felt, as I've indicated, that it was not right to have a superior force over the state, such as the federal courts, bringing them in, fining them, or whatever else they might do without that state's consent. And that's your blank, consent. All right, now you would have thought they were happy now. Wouldn't need any more amendments? Yep, they did. They needed another one. It wasn't very long before they recognized it, and that's the 12th Amendment. Now, the 12th Amendment was to correct some weaknesses, and that's your blank, some weaknesses in the Electoral College process. The Founding Fathers actually had 60 ballots in their effort to try and find out how to elect the president. Should governors do it, the Senate do it, the House do it, the people at large do it? They finally said, let's have each state select its finest citizens to sit down, evaluate the candidates, and then come to a vote. And they could vote for 2. That's the way they set it up originally. The electors would vote for 2, and whoever's tops will be president, the next man will be vice president. But under that system, it didn't work out so good, because the man who is president, number 1, found out sometimes that the man who's number 2 in line, is his political enemy, just sitting around for him to die. Almost need a food taster when that's the situation. Furthermore, when there were no parties, the original idea was probably practical, but as gradually the Federalists and Anti-Federalists developed, you would have a party was the dominant party, all voting for the same 2 people, and it would result in a tie. And that happened in 1800. And both Jefferson and Burr were tied. And so it threw it over into the House of Representatives, and again they voted, and it was a tie, because that was the dominant party. They'd all vote for 2, and it'd keep coming out the same. And they had to vote 35 times before Hamilton withheld his vote for Burr, and Jefferson became president and Burr vice president. Well, it was out of all of that they decided to have the 12th Amendment. And they provided that each party must give us separate ballots, one for the president, one for the vice president. No more of that 2-vote business. All right, capital A is separate. It also provided that a person running for president must have a majority of the votes, and that's your blank. Got to have a majority, or he can't serve as president. Well, now, if you get a 3rd or a 4th party running, you can see how it would be very possible for a president not to get a majority. And so they said that we'll take care of that. It said, number 1 is you wouldn't get a majority, so put that majority down too. Both B and 1 are majority. If that's the case, then you take the top 3 candidates and put them in the House of Representatives, and each state votes as a state to select the president. All right? 3 is your number. All right, capital C. A candidate for vice president also must have a majority. Majority. Now, in case he doesn't get a majority, the top 2 are put in the Senate, and the Senate decides which one will serve as vice president. So, number 1, you have the figure 2 in there. And it also requires that a person who runs for vice president must have the qualifications of a president. Now, that hadn't been thought of before, but obviously that makes sense. If he's going to be president, perhaps, why, he certainly should have those basic qualifications. Everybody have number 12 now? All right, the 13th Amendment. This one provides for universal freedom in America. And it took a lot of bloodshed and heartbreaks and destruction, fantastic amount of destruction, which many scholars thought it could have been avoided if the best leaders had been listened to, but they weren't. And so we had the 13th Amendment following the Civil War. And here's what it says: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States. Now, this was passed 2 years after, will you write that in the blank, capital A, after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Have you ever wondered why it was necessary to have the 13th Amendment when this great man had already issued his Emancipation Proclamation? Everybody should know the answer to that. It is simply this, that President Lincoln's proclamation only covered those areas at war with the Union. That's number one. At war with the Union. Did not cover bond servants or slaves in other areas, including parts of Virginia, Louisiana, and all of Tennessee. All right, 2. There was also some doubt as to whether or not this proclamation was within the constitutional war powers of the president. And that's your blank. The war powers of the president. All right, capital B. The only real difficulty we've had in enforcing this particular provision is deciding what involuntary servitude really is. And so we're going to say just a word about that. Supposing you went down to prison and you provided the bail for a prisoner, and you took him out to your farm and you made him work for you till he paid off that bail. Is that involuntary servitude or not? And the court said, yes, it is. It's a violation. So number 1 is yes. Now, supposing a prisoner is fined and he is told that if he works on the city parks or something, he can work out that fine. Would that be a violation? And it says no, because it provides right in the Constitution that in connection with crimes, a person who's been convicted can be involved in labor, involuntary servitude, as part of his punishment. And so number 3 goes right along with that. Is there a violation if a convicted prisoner is sentenced to a certain period of hard labor? And the answer, of course, is no, provided for right in the Constitution. All right? The 14th Amendment provides universal citizenship. See that blank up at the top? All right, citizenship. Now, this amendment was dated in 1868 and provided that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. Isn't that tremendous? Born or naturalized, they're automatically citizens, and that's your blank. And they have equal rights. And they cannot be abridged without due process of law, and that's your second blank. Now keep that in mind, that you can lose your inalienable rights. You can forfeit them yourself. No one else can take them from you without facing the wrath of the Creator. That's why they're inalienable. But a person can commit a crime and lose those rights, and that's what it means. They can be abridged by committing a crime or an offense against society or against our neighbors. But if that happens, you still can't have your property or your liberty taken away from you without due process of law. You are entitled to your day in court. Roman numeral 2, the amendment also provided not only citizenship for everybody in the United States, regardless of their former slavery or bond servant status, it also provided that all of the obligations owing the Confederacy, that's the states that had divided off and seceded, confederated together, all of their debts were null and void. Now that was very significant because it meant that all Confederate bonds and Confederate currency were now worthless. And so when you put the blank there is void, null and void. All right, the 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment provided for universal voting rights. Now, it wasn't quite universal. It was universal for males. And this amendment provided that the right of the citizen of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. We were going through a very difficult transition period, and we had a very wide cultural gap as to education and a lot of other things. And here were people that had been given freedom, had been given citizenship, but they weren't all getting the opportunity to vote for a variety of reasons. And so it was provided here that they would. Now you'll notice that this amendment does not include women, so it isn't really universal. That has to be taken care of a little later in the 19th Amendment in 1920. But at least all males universally were to have the right to vote, even though the provisions were made by the states as to who could vote. Had to be the same for everybody. They couldn't exclude anybody on account of race or former servitude. That's what that amendment is talking about. Now these three amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, are called the famous Civil War Amendments, designed to take our Constitution and spread it out so that there were no exceptions anymore to its application of freedom for all our people, and equal rights for all our people, and due process for all our people. That's the idea. Now, we're just working with human beings, and human beings have limitations and frailties. The founders recognized that. But to the extent that human beings can be just and can be fair to one another, the founding fathers wanted to encourage it. And that's why they gave us this particular structure of government. And now I come to one of the most interesting and I should say probably threatening amendments in the entire Constitution. The right of the federal government to come right down into the pocket of the individual citizen and do something the founding fathers thought that they had made unconstitutional. All right, that's the 16th Amendment. It's the Federal Income Tax Amendment. All right, now this has an extremely interesting history, and that's your first blank. First of all, the founding fathers were very concerned about direct taxes. Now, a direct tax is against you and your property. An indirect tax is one that's just put on tires or gasoline or something, so that the more you buy, the more taxes you pay. But it's against the thing, not against you. So that's an indirect tax. Now, a direct tax comes down and taxes you on your income, on your carriages. There were 2 or 3 cases. Things that belong to you, that's a direct tax. So capital A is direct. Direct. Now the founders said in case the government decides to go for the direct tax, it must apportion it among the states so they can go ahead and collect it. And it must be in terms of population. You can't do it in terms of income of people or of a state. That's right in the Constitution. But during the Civil War, an income tax was actually passed. And the Supreme Court kind of squinted its legal eyes and ignored it and called it an indirect tax, which it is not. So in 1894, which is capital C, the Supreme Court straightened that around and acknowledged that it was a direct tax. So will you put under B, indirect tax, which was the holding of the Supreme Court on the tax that was used during the Civil War, and then capital C, direct tax, which it really is, which makes it unconstitutional. The court said you can't have a federal income tax. It's a direct tax. It's outlawed. You've got to allocate it to the states on the basis of their population, not on people based on their income. So, capital D, in 1905, there was a great movement going on, had been going on now for 15 years. Soak the rich, soak the rich, soak the rich. So we got to get some of that money from the rich. Well, we had become the greatest industrial nation in the world. And the riches that had been accumulated by certain groups was what was creating all the good jobs and setting up a transcontinental railroad system. And we were coming now into automobile manufacturing. All this took a tremendous amount of capital But there are a lot of people standing on the sidelines says, we want some of that. We want some of that. So there began to be a movement, let's soak the rich, and that's your blank. Let's somehow soak the rich. All right, now the Founding Fathers said, we want equal protection of rights. You start soaking somebody because they happen to have a little more, then someday when you get a little more, you get soaked yourself. It's a lot better in the general circumstances to just have taxes uniformly applied so that, kind of like God's law, 10% for example, and the rich pay more because they make more, but they pay at the same rate. You see, people feel that's fair. But if you start, the more they make, the more you're going to take from them, then it's not equal protection anymore at all. And the rich resent it. And it's a violation of basic constitutional principles. Something to think about. But anyway, a lot of people were demanding we soak the rich. So in 1909, capital E, Senator Joseph W. Bailey, a Democrat from Texas, introduced an amendment to a tariff bill that would tax all incomes of $5,000 or more 2%. Now $5,000, that's like $50,000 or $60,000 today. It's going to be 2%. And there were a lot of Republicans too that were going along with this. But the wealthy people, they had senators and friends, and so they said, we've got to head that thing off, because once they start gouging a particular class of people, they can keep going forever until it's not 2%, it could be 90%. It could be total confiscation. So they said, the Congress is just absolutely immersed in the idea of soaking the rich. They want to soak the rich. So let's change it over to an amendment to kill the Bailey bill and get it out among the states that have to ratify it as an amendment. Surely they'll stop it there. And so that's what they decided to do. Capital H, or capital F, is amendment. Senator Aldrich of Rhode Island and some of the others got it shifted over to an amendment. Now, it was a Republican effort, and so they put it in because it was their bill, and it was designed to destroy the idea of an income tax, get it over into an amendment where they could defeat it. The Democrats had to vote for it because it was their idea to begin with. So in capital H, the Senate approved it 77-0. There were 77 there, and they all voted for it. Nobody voted against it. Everybody wanted to soak the rich, they said. Well, when they saw that it was passing, even the people that introduced it for the purpose of defeating the Bailey bill said, this is the kind of thing that would make the nation a nation of liars, and that's your blank, a nation of liars. This is a very dishonest way to go. People feel cheated by this kind of an affair, and it makes liars out of people. That was kind of interesting. Well, amazingly, guess what happened? Amazingly, contrary to all expectation, this is contrary to all expectations, the income tax amendment was ratified by one state legislature after another and was proclaimed in effect February 25th, 1913. And so to protect themselves, the rich began dumping all of their fortunes into huge foundations that had been specifically made tax exempt by previous laws. And so they started using their fortunes in other ways through foundations. Well, that's how we got the federal income tax in 1913. Now the 16th Amendment says, and I just want to read it briefly, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to census or enumeration. In other words, we're going after the people, and we're going to get it from them based on their income. And the 1040 form that you see here is one of the government forms, I guess the most disliked of all, as the people now feel that they're being bled, because now up to 43% of everybody's income is being drained off in some kind of taxes, a lot of it in federal taxes. Just a few thoughts here. Capital A, this tax is now 10 times higher for the average citizen than originally promised. 10 times. And the resources that have flowed into the federal government as a result of the 16th Amendment have done more to corrupt our system and destroy the original American pattern than I guess anything else that's been done. And so corrupt is your blank. All right? Number one, let's give us some examples. By spending billions of dollars on domestic programs, there has been a serious breakdown in separation of powers of state rights. Because who's going to resist it? We can get millions and millions of dollars coming into our state to, for the schools, for example. The founders said, don't ever let the federal government get in on schools. Next thing you know, they'll be in on the churches. They'll be dictating to you policies that you won't want. And they'll do it with money. Don't allow it, they said. We want your schools to thrive, but not with federal money. That'll kill them. Number two, it created a serious amount of abject dependency on Washington for some of the most trivial needs of cities, states, and individual citizens. Well, now, I'm sort of proud of Al Smith, head of the Democratic Party back in my youth. He ran against Herbert Hoover, didn't win, but he was a great American. And in 1936, he stood up and he said, I want to tell those that are running this government that you are betraying it. We're changing from Americanism to socialism, and we are making a partner and a comrade out of Moscow in violation of the most basic things we believe. And he got a standing ovation, but unfortunately, everybody then just walked away. I count Al Smith a great American and former head of the Democratic Party, and one of those who helped write the platform for 1932 for the Democratic Party, which was immediately abandoned, like the Republican platform of 1968 was immediately abandoned after it was adopted. Anyway, I wanted you to know a little bit about Al Smith. And in my book, The Naked Capitalist, I put in this great speech in the appendix so that Americans of today could see what this great American saw coming that you and I now have happening to us. All right, number one then was rights, states' rights, and number two is individual citizens, and number three, the fair and impartial collection of federal taxes has proven impossible. It's just impossible. I have good friends who are in the IRS, and they said, really, you almost have to violate the Fourth Amendment rights of privacy of people anyway to find out who's doing what. And it just can't be fairly administered. That's just generally recognized and admitted, and something needs to be done about this whole area. And in the Freeman Institute, we're presently doing a lot of research on some options, some alternatives that are reasonable, that will not hurt the legitimate aspects of government in any way, but will get this burden off the back of the American people and get this money flowing back in the private sector where it belongs. All right, let's go to the 17th Amendment now. Now, that was backed by the same people that were backing the 16th Amendment. They had some big plans that they were going to do with this money that was coming into the federal government. And they knew that there was one body that might object to the way they were going to use it, and that was the Senate. Now, originally, the Founding Fathers had senators appointed by the state legislatures to protect states' rights. In other words, they went back there not as a result of a popularity contest at the polls, but because they were selected by the state legislatures because they had a lot of background and they were men of integrity. They would be trusted. That was the idea. There would be some exceptions, of course. Human beings, you know how they are. But anyway, they would go back there and they would watch to make sure that this House of Representatives didn't violate states' rights with some of its bills and some of its appropriation of money. All right, so capital A is senators were originally to be appointed by the state legislatures to represent the states and its rights. Legislatures. Now, capital B, when Jefferson got back from France, where he was during the writing of the Constitutional Convention, he was concerned lest the Senate become a House of Lords or something. And he asked Washington, why did you put it in there in the first place? And Washington said, why did you pour your hot drink into your saucer? And Jefferson said, well, obviously to cool it. And Washington said, and that's the purpose of a Senate, to cool any hot-headed legislation that comes up from the House. So your blank is cool it. All right? Capital C, the purpose of the Senate was to veto any radical movements designed to break down property rights and states' rights or the established order of constitutional government. That was the original purpose. Now, the House began, first of all, responding to an amendment to somehow get rid of that arrangement. and have senators elected by the people. Sounded more democratic, didn't it? But the founders knew that this would take out an important part of the balance of our constitutional system. But notice what the House did under capital D. They started in 1893, 1894, 1898, 1900, 1902, asking for an amendment that would make senators elected by popular vote and not appointed by their state legislatures. And the Senate always would vote it down, and that's your blank under capital D. They'd vote it down. All right? The amendment was finally pushed through, however, under long, strenuous pressure. It was finally pushed through both the House and the Senate in 1911, and it became a ratified part of the Constitution in 1913, the same year as the 16th Amendment. 1913. From then on, senators have to be voted in by popular vote. And notice what that does. Now you've got congressmen coming along and saying, vote for me, I can get more money from the federal government for you. The senator comes along and instead of resisting that, says, and vote for me, I can get more too. So who's watching states' rights back in Washington? It's been taken away with the 17th Amendment. All right, under Roman numeral II, the Senate has ceased to be a guardian of states' rights. Will you put that down? Ceased to be a guardian of states' rights. And the Senate no longer represents the established order of things, but often initiates more collectivist legislation than the House itself. As of 1980, this is your last, the third one. As of 1980, the Senate voting record indicates that it would need at least 29 more constitutionalists in the Senate to have a majority and do the things that the Founding Fathers originally intended the Senate to do, and that is to protect states' rights and the establishment of the sovereign states as the founders had set it up. Well, that brings us to the end of the first half of our 13th lesson, and we are going to begin the last half of our 13th lesson in our next session, and it will begin with a discussion of the 18th Amendment. And you know, that has a very interesting history, both as to why it was adopted, which may surprise you, and why it was ultimately found that it should be abandoned. Now, as you know, it was put in as a crime, as an offense, which the founders had warned against, but that's the way it was done, and it'll be interesting to see just how it all turned out in our next session. Thank you very much.